So I started working in the Clayman Institute in 2008 as a marketer with an expertise in brand management. And what they said was, we want to see how far knowledge travels. And what that means in a traditional academic unit is we want a communication specialist that will translate what research is so other people understand it. And what I came to understand, my real value was in seeing the value of research, in understanding how a layperson might use research to move themselves into action. So for 5 years, I was working on this and developing products and ways of us integrating marketing into research. And I'll say, I've become a little bilingual. I do understand what you mean when you say theoretical framework. And I would argue my colleagues at the Clayman Institute have become bilingual, and they start to question things around the value of research. But in 2013, eBay asked me to do a keynote presentation at their Women's Initiative Network to talk about this, and I said, oh, I don't do that. That's what they do. And they said, no, we want you to help people see what to do. We understand that bias exists, we just don't know what to do about it. So I'm going to show you an exercise I developed from them in language based on a research study that I read, which was about, at Rice University, they studied how letters of recommendation with communal or agentic language affected the outcome and whether those candidates were perceived as good candidates for leadership. So what I do is I ask people in my audience to describe a top performer, just to describe them with a few words. And I say top performer, top performer, top performer many times. And I say, do a thought experiment with me. Imagine I recruited that top performer away and you have to pick a substitute. And this would never happen. Just imagine these two descriptions are the summaries of those two candidates. And it is a thought experiment, so I know they're written really differently. Just go with me, pick one. And in the audiences, traditionally, they'll pick 80% description B. Now, when they're really smart, of course, they'll wait to see, and they'll know I'm a gender from our Gender Research Institute, and we'll see more balanced. Now we're starting to do other written experiments and then revealing the results so we can show the difference. Now, this talk has actually become really helpful for us. I've given it over 10,000 times in a number of to 10,000 people in a number of companies. But of course, working at Gender Research Institute, they push me and they say, well, does this really create change? Or are people just now seeing bias? So our framework is what we call see bias, block bias. So the first half is what I just did was help people see bias. And then we had to come up with other ways to help them block bias. And so I'm going to talk about our research projects that kind of underpin what this dynamic does. And the first one, we worked with an internet company. Shelley Carell presented this work last time. And we went through their performance reviews. And what we came up with was a review of the kinds of languages that are used to describe what we might call a woman's brand and a man's brand at companies. So this was our See Bias project. We really are defining the ways that we can start to understand how men or women are described differently and valued differently. But when we go to the teams and say, what would you like to do to fix this? They're like, well, you can't just switch the language, right? You have to do something else. So that's phase 2 of our project, which is not See Bias, but what we would call our block bias interventions, where we're asking teams to co-design solutions with us to block bias. And while they've used the tool of language to see how it works in their workplace, they do not use language as a tool to then block bias. We'll give them a suite of options to choose. What would you like to do to fix bias in your team? The number one solution they tend to pick is what they call their criteria checklist. Now, there are 2 dimensions of this that are really important. One is that they actually define criteria of performance before they evaluate people. The second is in a conversation, they align around the meaning of both, I guess you would call it the internal and the external narrative of these words. And as a result, we found that language helps you see what bias, how it plays out in your workplace, but to get at the internal narrative, we've developed tools that help them understand how to use criteria in order to block bias. Thank you.